In 1951, the air in Colorado carried with it a strange kind of silence, the type that settles in a valley where the mountains loom like sentinels and the wind always seems to whisper of something forgotten. At the end of Hidden Valley Road, down a gravel path that most locals didn't bother to travel, there stood a house that seemed both ordinary and unsettling at once. The Galvin family had made it their home, a large two-story structure with white clapboard siding, a wide porch, and windows that reflected the endless skies of the west. To anyone passing by, it looked like the picture of domestic hope. America, in its post-war glow, families thriving, children laughing, the future bright. Yet behind the facade, the Galvin story was destined to become one of the most disturbing family sagas that medical science had ever encountered. Don Galvin was a military man, hardened by discipline, proud of his service, and eager to build the kind of legacy America told its sons they could have after the war. He had married Mimi, a woman with an almost unshakable optimism who believed in order, in faith, in the sanctity of family. Together they imagined the road ahead would be filled with blessings, and in the early days it seemed to be so. Their first children came quickly, and then more, until soon the Galvin house was bursting with energy and noise. 12 children, one after another, their faces shining with the same pale eyes and dark hair, filled the rooms with chaos and laughter. Neighbors marveled at the size of the family. In an era where large broods were not uncommon, the Galvins seemed to be something out of a myth, a tribe within a single household. From the outside, the family looked enviable. Don maintained his position with dignity. Mimi kept the home in order, and the children filled the community with their presence, attending school, church, and neighborhood events. The Galvin house stood as a symbol of what many families aspired to: stability, abundance, and strength. But within the walls, there were undercurrents no one could see. The long hallways sometimes echoed with cries that weren't playful. Doors slammed in the night. And there were moments when Mimi, folding laundry or preparing dinner, would look into the eyes of one of her sons and feel a chill, as though she were staring at something she couldn't name but instinctively feared. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as many curses do. The eldest sons were growing restless in ways that went beyond typical adolescence. One boy's temper became unmanageable, his mood swinging wildly, his words sharp and unpredictable. Another withdrew into silence, his gaze often fixed on something invisible, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. At first, Mimi dismissed it as growing pains, stress, or simple rebellion. Don, too, brushed off the signs, insisting that discipline would correct what he considered mere defiance. But there were nights when Mimi would sit awake, her heart pounding, as footsteps echoed down the hallway long after the children should have been asleep. The noises weren't ordinary creaks of a settling house. They carried with them a deliberate weight, like someone pacing endlessly, unable to rest. Whispers began to ripple through the community, though few dared to voice them openly. The Galvins were respected, admired even, but there was something about the house that unsettled those who visited. Some claimed the place felt cold, no matter the season. Others said the children's eyes seemed too old, too knowing, as though they were keeping secrets far beyond their years. The family dismissed these observations politely, but they did not go unnoticed. Hidden Valley Road became more than just an address. It became a place locals spoke of with caution, a home that seemed to carry an invisible weight. Mimi clung desperately to the idea that love and faith could cure any ailment. She prayed over her children, guided them through routines, and filled the house with structure. Yet as the years passed, the signs grew harder to ignore. Sudden outbursts turned violent. The children began turning on each other, shouting, breaking things, retreating into worlds only they seemed to understand. The once harmonious noise of a large family had shifted into something chaotic and frightening. The laughter that had filled the halls was replaced with screams, mutterings, and long silences that seemed to stretch on without end. Still, to the outside world, the Galvins remained the perfect family. Don continued his work with pride. Mimi maintained appearances with grace, and the children, at least in public, played their parts well enough to avoid suspicion. But the house itself seemed to absorb the truth, its walls soaking up every cry, every clash, every whispered voice. And though no one could yet put words to it, the Galvin family had already stepped into a story that would one day terrify genetic science, a living testament to a curse that could not be explained away by faith or discipline alone. On Hidden Valley Road, a family was unraveling, one child at a time. To anyone who passed the white clapboard house on Hidden Valley Road in those early years, the Galvins seemed to embody the American dream. A proud father, a devoted mother, and 12 children who filled the yard with laughter, chores, and endless games. Visitors would often remark on Mimi's poise and Don's strength, marveling at how the couple managed such a household with discipline and grace. In a post-war America, when television families were beginning to paint an image of flawless domestic bliss, the Galvins appeared to be a living version of that very fantasy. Mimi leaned into that role with determination. She kept her children clean, well-fed, and presentable, making sure they attended Mass every Sunday, their hair combed, their clothes neat, their behavior respectful. Her pride in her family was a shield, something she clung to whenever cracks began to show beneath the surface. She was determined that no one, not the neighbors, not the priests, not even her closest friends, would ever see the turmoil that occasionally rippled through her home. She convinced herself that order could be maintained if she simply held tighter to the reins. Don, meanwhile, took pride in his career and the authority it gave him both inside and outside the home. He demanded obedience from his children, expecting them to uphold the values he believed had carried him through war and into a life of respectability. His sons were to be strong, disciplined, and loyal. His daughters were to be graceful, obedient, and supportive. The Galvin household did not allow for weakness, nor did Don have much patience for the subtler struggles of childhood. To him, discipline was the cure for almost anything. At first, it seemed to work. The older boys excelled in school and sports. The younger ones followed suit, learning from their brothers, while the sisters worked quietly to keep up with Mimi's expectations of order and femininity. Outsiders envied the family's size and apparent happiness. In church, they filled an entire pew, their heads bowed in unison, their voices rising together in hymn. Teachers described them as bright, well-mannered, though a bit unruly in numbers. Neighbors praised Mimi's stamina and Don's leadership, often commenting that if any family could handle 12 children, it was surely the Galvins. But inside the home, a different picture was forming. Mimi noticed first, though she tried to ignore it. There were moments when her boys' eyes looked different, glassy, distant, as if they were not entirely present. She brushed it aside as fatigue or imagination. Then came the moods. One son, growing angry over the smallest slight, another sinking into quiet despair for days on end. At dinner, the family table became a stage for sudden quarrels, words escalating into shouts, shouts into slaps, and sometimes worse. Mimi would step in, smoothing over the chaos, offering smiles and reassurances, determined to reset the order. Don, when home, would cut the arguments short with his booming voice, his authority silencing the children even if the unrest lingered. Yet Mimi knew something was different, something she could not control. She began to see patterns, familiar shadows passing from one child to the next, as though an invisible thread wound its way through their blood. At night, lying awake while Don slept, she replayed the day in her mind, wondering if it was her fault. She had given birth to so many children, perhaps too many, and she began to question whether the sheer size of the family had invited chaos. But the truth ran deeper than she dared imagine. The older boys, once seen as role models, began to struggle more openly. One drifted into frightening outbursts, his fists slamming into walls, his words twisting into threats that made even his siblings cower. Another began speaking to people who weren't there, his laughter carrying through the halls at odd hours. Mimi whispered prayers over them, desperate for God to intervene, but the prayers felt heavier each time, as if the heavens were not listening. Still, Mimi refused to let the outside world glimpse the darkness. To visitors, she spoke proudly of her son's accomplishments, of Don's steady work, of the blessings of a large family. She dressed her daughters in matching clothes, their ribbons perfectly tied, their shoes polished. She welcomed neighbors with coffee and pie, smiling even when she felt hollow inside. She had learned the art of pretending, not only for others, but for herself. If she could maintain the illusion of perfection, perhaps the truth would never catch up to her. The children, too, learned to play their parts. At school, they appeared normal enough, though teachers began noticing small oddities: a vacant stare, an odd comment, an unexplained outburst. Nothing seemed severe enough to warrant alarm, but the whispers began. Some classmates avoided the Galvin children, sensing something strange beneath their friendly exteriors. Others envied them, wishing they belonged to such a large, seemingly lively brood. The contradiction only deepened the sense that the Galvin family was a riddle no one could quite solve. As the years passed, the balance grew harder to maintain. Each child carried their own burden, but the collective weight pressed down on the entire household. The facade of perfection remained for outsiders, but inside, Mimi began to feel as though she were living on borrowed time, waiting for something terrible to reveal itself. She didn't yet know the name for what was unraveling within her family. She couldn't imagine that doctors and scientists would one day descend on Hidden Valley Road to study the lives of her children. All she knew was that her perfect family was not perfect at all. It was a house filled with shadows, and those shadows were growing darker. The first time Mimi admitted, even silently to herself, that something was terribly wrong was the night she found her eldest son pacing in the kitchen, whispering to someone who wasn't there. The house was quiet, the younger children long asleep, Dawn away on duty. She had risen to get a glass of water when she heard the murmur of voices. At first, she thought one of the boys had snuck out of bed with a friend, but when she peered into the kitchen, she saw him standing alone, his eyes darting to corners of the room as though shadows had come alive and were speaking to him. His hands shook. His words spilled out in fragments, accusations, questions, laughter that didn't sound like his own. When she called his name, he froze, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes, before bolting past her and slamming the door to his bedroom. She told no one. Not Dawn, not the neighbors, not even her priest. She convinced herself it was exhaustion, perhaps stress from school, maybe even a fever she hadn't noticed. Mothers always found explanations. It was how they survived. But deep down, she felt something inside her shift, as though a door had opened onto a darkness she did not understand. The episode spread like cracks in glass. Another son began showing. Signs, not whispers, but rages that came without warning. He would be cheerful at breakfast, even playful, but by afternoon he might be hurling chairs across the room, fists pounding the walls until his knuckles bled. Mimi tried to soothe him, prayed over him, sometimes held him tightly against her chest, as though her own heartbeat could steady his. But the storm always returned, unpredictable and terrifying. The younger children began to fear their brothers, learning to stay quiet, to tiptoe around the house when the older boys were unsettled. Don's response was predictable: discipline. To him, there was no mystery in a boy who defied authority. He ordered extra chores, shouted lectures, demanded obedience. When violence erupted, he met it with force, his voice booming through the halls like a drill sergeant silencing a barracks. But even Don began to notice that his commands no longer worked the way they once had. The boy's eyes didn't show shame or fear. Sometimes they didn't seem to register him at all. They stared through him, as though he were a ghost. The neighbors started to notice small things: a window shattered in the night, shouts echoing from the house when the rest of the street was asleep, a boy walking barefoot in the snow, his eyes vacant, his steps unhurried as though he couldn't feel the cold. When questions were asked, Mimi offered practiced explanations: a game gone wrong, a temper tantrum, children being children. Most accepted her words politely, but suspicion hung in the air like a low cloud. Hidden Valley Road was becoming a place of whispers. The younger children, still too small to understand, began to live in two worlds: the bright, orderly family their parents insisted they were, and the darker one where their brothers became strangers. They witnessed scenes they could never forget: a sibling smashing a mirror and bleeding without flinching, another muttering at invisible figures, another threatening to kill himself if anyone touched him again. Their childhoods became a careful dance between love and fear, between laughter in the yard and terror in the halls. Mimi herself grew gaunt, her once hopeful eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She still clung to the rituals of family life, Sunday Mass, holiday dinners, the steady rhythm of chores. But beneath her careful order, chaos pulsed. She sought advice from doctors in town who offered vague explanations: nerves, stress, hormonal changes, even bad behavior. None gave her answers, and none seemed to take her fears seriously. The words mental illness were rarely spoken in those years, and when they were, they carried shame so heavy that most families buried them beneath silence. Mimi was determined her family would not be branded, but the silence only deepened the curse. By the late 1950s, the Galvin house had changed. The older boys no longer fit into the mold of ordinary adolescence. Their tempers, their hallucinations, their erratic behavior grew sharper, more undeniable. Mimi's dreams of sending her sons to college, to the military, to respectable careers, were slipping away. Some of them had begun dropping out of school, unable to concentrate, too disruptive to continue. Others turned inward, isolating themselves, retreating into corners of the house where they muttered or stared into nothing for hours. The daughters, caught in the middle, bore silent witness. They learned to soothe their brothers when possible, to avoid them when necessary, to carry secrets that weighed heavier than their young shoulders could bear. They loved them. How could they not? But they also feared them, and that fear shaped every choice they made. Don refused to admit weakness in his family. To him, the problem was disobedience, lack of respect, rebellion against his authority. He would not tolerate talk of illness or affliction. He forbade Mimi from speaking of the incidents outside the home, insisting that what happened on Hidden Valley Road stayed within its walls. But each time Mimi heard glass break, each time she heard a scream that didn't sound human, each time she saw the look in her son's eyes, she felt the truth pressing harder. This was not rebellion. This was not something discipline could cure. It was something deeper, darker, and far beyond her understanding. And though she could not know it yet, the unraveling of her sons was not simply a tragedy for her family. It was the opening act of a mystery that would one day pull doctors and scientists from across the country to her doorstep, desperate to understand the disease that seemed to bloom within the Galvin bloodline. By the early 1960s, the Galvin household had become a fortress of contradictions. On the outside, it was still the same white house on Hidden Valley Road, framed by trees and wide Colorado skies. To those who passed by, it looked like the home of a thriving family, 12 children spilling into the yard, laughter mingling with the barking of dogs, the clatter of bicycles on gravel. But behind closed doors, the house had become something far more unsettling. It was a place where silence could stretch for hours, broken suddenly by screams, where joy turned to fear in the span of a heartbeat, and where Mimi walked the halls as both caretaker and warden, trying to keep the balance from shattering completely. The brothers who had first shown signs of trouble were now unmistakably lost to something no one in the family could name. One son, tall and strong, slipped further into rages that bordered on the dangerous. His voice, once booming with confidence, now carried strange tones, sometimes a preacher's thunder, sometimes a madman's shriek. He broke things not out of accident, but out of fury. Lamps, dishes, chairs splintered under his fists. His siblings learned to scatter when his moods shifted, disappearing into corners or slipping out into the yard, praying he would burn himself out before someone was hurt. Another had retreated almost completely from the world. He sat for hours in the same chair, eyes glazed, hands twitching as though playing with something invisible. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words came in fragments that made little sense, leaving Mimi with the feeling she was eavesdropping on a private conversation between him and voices no one else could hear. The sisters, caught in the middle of this growing storm, lived in constant fear. They tiptoed around their brothers, careful not to provoke them, careful not to be alone in a room with them when their moods turned. They carried silent wounds, memories of threats, of sudden hands grabbing their arms too tightly, of moments they never spoke about aloud. They learned early how to make themselves small, how to vanish in their own home. And when they cried, they did so quietly, muffling their sobs into pillows so Mimi would not hear. Mimi herself became a woman split in two. By day, she clung to her image of the devoted mother, cheerful and orderly, keeping the family fed and dressed, sending them out into the world as though nothing were wrong. By night, she was a sentinel, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every murmur in the dark. She knew the signs too well now, the tightening of a jaw, the vacant stare, the quickening steps in the hallway, and she braced herself each time for what might come next. She prayed more fervently than ever, but the prayers had begun to feel like rituals performed to hold back a tide too strong to stop. Don remained blind by choice. To him, the house was still a place of order, his family still a reflection of his strength. He refused to acknowledge the whispers he must have heard, the fear he must have seen in his daughter's eyes, the violence he must have felt vibrating in the walls. His solution was always the same: discipline, control, silence. He barked orders, enforced rules, and when things grew too heated, he walked away, leaving Mimi to gather the broken pieces. The neighbors no longer asked questions. They had learned enough to know that the Galvin family was different, though they didn't know why. Strange things happened at that house. A boy wandering the road at night, muttering, a sudden piercing scream breaking through the silence of winter evenings. Police arriving once or twice, their visits brief and hushed. Yet the Galvins remained respected in name, if not in truth. Few dared to pry too deeply. Inside, the curse grew stronger. The younger children began to realize that what they were witnessing was not simply bad behavior. They saw the way their brothers' faces changed, the way their eyes seemed to belong to someone else in those moments, the way their words slipped into nonsense or violence. They began to understand that there was something inside their family, something that lived in their blood. They whispered about it to each other in the dark, too frightened to speak of it in daylight. The sisters bore the heaviest burden. They loved their brothers. They remembered the days when they played together in the yard, when the house was filled with laughter. But that love was mixed with fear, resentment, even shame. They carried secrets that made them feel stained, secrets they could not tell their mother, who seemed too fragile to bear them, and never their father, who would dismiss them as lies. They learned that in the Galvin house, silence was survival. It was during these years that the house itself seemed to transform. To Mimi, it no longer felt like a home, but a vessel carrying them all toward some unknown doom. The walls, she thought, carried the voices of her sons. The floors, worn by pacing footsteps, seemed alive with restless energy. Even the air felt heavy, thick with tension. She dreamed sometimes of running away, of taking the younger children and fleeing into a new life, but the thought brought shame crashing down on her. She was a mother. She had made vows. She would not abandon her family, no matter how cursed they seemed. Yet each day, the shadows lengthened. Each son who fell into madness made the next more inevitable, as though a line had been drawn, and all they could do was wait for each to cross it. And while Mimi struggled to hold the family together, she knew, deep in her bones, that they were slipping beyond her grasp. What she could not know, not yet, was that the darkness inside her home was not just personal tragedy. It was something far larger, something that would one day draw the eyes of doctors, scientists, and the entire world to Hidden Valley Road. But for now, it was only Mimi, her daughters, and the madness of her sons, all locked behind doors that the outside world refused to open. By the late 1960s, what had once been whispered behind closed doors could no longer be contained. Too many of the Galvin sons had crossed the threshold from strange behavior into unmistakable madness. The house on Hidden Valley Road was no longer merely a troubled household. It was a place unraveling. The older boys had slipped deep into psychosis, hallucinations, violent rages, paranoia that made them see enemies in every corner. The younger children, still trapped in that house, bore witness as each brother seemed to be claimed by an invisible hand. For years, Mimi had struggled in silence, convinced that prayer and perseverance could hold her family together. Don, stubborn in his pride, had refused to seek help beyond stern lectures and punishment. But when one son nearly strangled another in a fit of rage, when police were called after a neighbor saw a Galvin boy wandering barefoot and bloodied in the snow, the family could no longer hide. The world beyond Hidden Valley Road had begun to see the cracks. It was a doctor in Colorado Springs who first whispered a word that chilled Mimi. Schizophrenia. He said it carefully as though the word itself might break her. He explained that it was an illness of the mind, one that science barely understood. There was no cure, only management, and even that was tenuous. For Mimi, the word was both a relief. At last, someone acknowledged this was not simply rebellion and a curse. A label meant shame. A label meant her sons were marked. She clung to denial, insisting they were just sensitive or overworked. But in her heart, she knew the truth was far darker. One by one, more of the sons began to carry the same diagnosis. The doctors spoke of chemical imbalances, of delusions, of genetic vulnerabilities. But in those years, treatments were crude at best. Institutions loomed as the primary solution. Cold, gray hospitals where men were sedated into silence, their lives stripped down to endless corridors and locked wards. Some Galvin sons cycled in and out of those places, returning home only to relapse again. Others resisted entirely, convinced the doctors were part of conspiracies against them. For Mimi, the weight was unbearable. She still clung to the facade of normalcy, still dressed her children for church, still welcomed neighbors with practiced smiles. But inside, she was drowning. Her daughters begged her to leave, to take them away from the violence and fear. But Mimi refused. She told them family was sacred, that they must endure together. In her mind, breaking apart would be admitting defeat, abandoning her faith, betraying everything she believed about motherhood. It was in this crucible of chaos that science began to take interest. Word spread quietly among psychiatric researchers. Here was a family with not one or two members afflicted by schizophrenia, but several, perhaps more than half of the sons. It was an extraordinary, almost unbelievable case, the kind of family geneticists dreamed of finding but rarely did. If madness could be mapped, if its origins could be traced, surely it would be through bloodlines like the Galvins. Doctors began to appear, sometimes under the guise of offering help, sometimes with more transparent intentions. They drew blood, asked endless questions, interviewed siblings, and probed into every detail of the family's history. They wanted to know everything: when the first symptoms appeared, what the boys had eaten, what traumas they'd suffered, whether Mimi had been sick while pregnant, whether Don's military service had left scars that seeped into his children. They treated the family as a living laboratory, their tragedy a rare window into the mysteries of the human mind. Mimi cooperated because she believed it was her duty, and perhaps because part of her hoped science would provide answers where prayer had failed. She opened her doors to the researchers, sat patiently as they catalogued her family's suffering. But for the daughters, it felt like another violation. They were subjects now, not children, studied, scrutinized, dissected with questions that never seemed to end. Their home became less of a refuge and more of a specimen jar, sealed for examination. The brothers, who were still lucid enough to speak, sometimes lashed out at the scientists, accusing them of conspiracies, of poisoning their blood, of trying to control their minds. Others simply stared vacantly, answering in broken sentences, their inner worlds impenetrable. The doctors scribbled notes, their faces neutral, but their fascination was unmistakable. The Galvin family was no longer just a family. They were a case, a genetic mystery that could shape the future of psychiatric science. Don resented the intrusion, though even he could no longer deny that something extraordinary was happening. He tolerated the doctors, stood stiffly during interviews, and avoided eye contact when the word heredity was mentioned. To admit that madness ran in his bloodline felt like an accusation too heavy to bear, a flaw in his legacy. He preferred to think of his sons as troubled, misguided, perhaps unlucky, but never cursed. To him, curses belonged in fairy tales, not in his home. Yet every broken plate, every scream in the night, every visit to the hospital told him otherwise. By the early 1970s, the Galvins had become more than a family struggling in isolation. They were whispered about in medical conferences, their blood samples stored in laboratories, their tragedies dissected by minds eager to crack the code of madness. Hidden Valley Road was no longer hidden at all. It was being mapped in chromosomes, in case files, in the cold language of science. But for Mimi and her daughters, the intrusion of science did little to ease their suffering. The house remained the same: shattered glass, fearful whispers, footsteps in the night. The curse did not lift simply because men in white coats had given it a name. If anything, the burden grew heavier. Because now they knew this was not an accident, not mere coincidence. It was in them, part of them, running through their veins like a shadow that would not let go. And with each new son who fell, the daughters could not help but wonder, would it come for them too? By the mid-1970s, the Galvin family was no longer simply a household in crisis. They had become a case study, a whispered legend among psychiatrists and geneticists, and an object of quiet dread among neighbors who crossed the street rather than walk past the White House on Hidden Valley Road. But inside that house, the family continued to live their private nightmare, paying a price that science could not measure and the world could not fully understand. The afflicted sons cycled in and out of institutions, their lives a revolving door of hospital wards, medications, and sudden returns home. The treatments of the time were blunt instruments, heavy doses of antipsychotic drugs that dulled the senses, left bodies sluggish, hands trembling, faces fixed in empty masks. For a time, the drugs seemed to help, blunting the voices, taming the rages. But the side effects were brutal, and many of the sons resisted, refusing their pills, slipping back into the grip of hallucinations and paranoia. The cycle repeated endlessly: crisis, hospitalization, sedation, release, relapse. Mimi watched helplessly as her sons faded, piece by piece. She sat at their bedsides in sterile hospital rooms, her prayers whispered into the hum of fluorescent lights. She fed them when they would not eat, soothed them when they raged, and argued with doctors when she felt they were more interested in research than healing. But she also carried shame. Each time she walked into church, each time she greeted a neighbor, she felt the weight of what was unspoken, that her family was not whole, that her sons were broken in ways that could not be fixed. She buried that shame under layers of cheerfulness, smiling until her face hurt, determined to keep up the image of the faithful mother who could endure anything. Her daughters, however, could not bury their scars so easily. They lived in fear, not only of their brother's outbursts, but also of their silence, the way they would stare too long, or mutter threats in voices that no longer sounded like their own. Some of the girls had been cornered, touched, or threatened in ways that left them trembling long after the moment had passed. They told no one. How could they? To speak of it would be to unravel what little order their mother clung to, and their father would only dismiss it as lies or exaggerations. So they carried it quietly, their childhoods marked by a loneliness deeper than words. As the years went on, the Galvins began to fracture. Some of the children fled as soon as they were old enough, desperate to escape the chaos, carrying guilt for leaving their mother behind. Others stayed, tethered by loyalty or fear, their own futures consumed by the needs of their brothers. Don grew more distant, his pride bruised, his authority eroded. He remained stern, but the house had long ago slipped beyond his control. He buried himself in work and avoided the truth, leaving Mimi and the daughters to shoulder the weight. The scientists, meanwhile, kept coming. They marveled at the extraordinary concentration of illness in one family. 6 sons diagnosed with schizophrenia, others showing symptoms, a pattern so rare it was almost unheard of. They drew blood, collected medical histories, and filed away, samples that would sit in freezers for decades. To them, the Galvins were not just tragic, they were invaluable. Here was a genetic map, a family whose suffering might one day unlock the mysteries of one of the most devastating mental illnesses known to man. But the Galvins themselves gained little from this interest. There were no cures, no breakthroughs. That eased their burden. The research papers piled up, the theories multiplied, but inside the house, the screams still echoed, the doors still slammed, and the daughters still wept quietly in their rooms. The price of their contribution was not glory or healing. It was the slow erosion of a family. The burden of secrecy grew heavier too. The Galvin name carried whispers in town, and the children who tried to build lives outside the home found themselves marked. They were the ones from the crazy family. Prospective friends or partners hesitated, unsure of what they were walking into. Some of the children carried shame so deep they refused to speak of their brothers at all, inventing new narratives for their lives, burying the truth as though it were a corpse. And yet, for all the pain, Mimi refused to surrender to despair. She told herself her family's suffering had purpose, that perhaps God had chosen them to bear this burden so that others might one day be spared. It was the only way she could reconcile the years of anguish, the broken windows, the violent nights, the endless hospital visits. She transformed tragedy into sacrifice, convinced that one day the world would understand why the Galvins had been chosen. But the price of that belief was high. Her daughters felt abandoned by her refusal to act, her insistence on silence, her devotion to appearances. Her sons, trapped in their own minds, lived in cycles of torment that no amount of faith could break. And Dawn, proud and unyielding, left behind a legacy not of strength, but of denial. By the 1980s, Hidden Valley Road was no longer a place of envy or admiration. It was a place of fear, of sadness, of science. The family had become both specimen and cautionary tale, their suffering a currency for progress they might never see. The Galvins were no longer simply a family. They were a genetic secret that demanded a terrible price, and still, the curse was not finished with them. By the time the last of the Galvin children were grown, the house on Hidden Valley Road had become something more than a home. To the outside world, it was a place of legend, half tragic, half mythical, the kind of house people lowered their voices to speak about. To the medical community, it was a treasure chest of genetic clues, an unparalleled case that would shape research for decades. But to the surviving members of the family, it was simply the site of their deepest wounds, the place where love and terror had lived side by side until they were almost indistinguishable. 6 of the 12 children, 6 sons, were ultimately diagnosed with schizophrenia, each lost to hallucinations, paranoia, or violent rages that marked their lives like scars carved into stone. Some spent their final years in hospitals or group homes, heavily medicated, their lives narrowed to routines of pills and silence. Others drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes reaching for normalcy, sometimes falling back into the abyss. A few died young, their bodies and minds worn down by illness, leaving behind unanswered questions and unspoken grief. The daughters carried their own scars, quieter but no less profound. They had lived through years of terror, secrecy, and abuse, emotional, physical, sometimes worse. For them, the legacy was not only the risk of madness in their blood, but also the deep ache of betrayal. They had been taught to hide, to endure, to protect the family name at all costs. Many of them left Colorado as soon as they could, trying to build lives elsewhere. But the shadows of Hidden Valley Road followed them. Trust was difficult, love was complicated, and silence was ingrained in them like a second language. Mimi, who had once clung to the dream of being the perfect mother, carried the burden of her family's suffering into her final years. She remained steadfast in her faith, insisting that the Galvin story had meaning, that their suffering was not in vain. Yet even she, in her private moments, must have wondered what might have been if she had spoken out sooner, if she had fled with her daughters, if she had refused to let silence reign for so long. The question haunted her, though she rarely voiced it. Don left behind a more complicated legacy. To some of his children, he was a figure of strength, the unbending father who demanded order in a house teetering on chaos. To others, he was the man who turned away, who denied the truth, who placed pride above protection. In the end, he could not control what had come for his family, and the illusion of authority he had clung to was stripped bare. The scientists, meanwhile, continued their work. The Galvin blood samples, stored for years in freezers, became central to groundbreaking studies in the 1980s and 1990s. Researchers traced genetic markers, compared DNA, and began to map the biological underpinnings of schizophrenia in ways never before possible. They confirmed what the Galvins had lived, that heredity could play a devastating role, that madness could run through bloodlines with merciless precision. The Galvin family had, unwillingly, become one of the most important families in the history of psychiatric research. And yet, the discoveries brought little comfort to those who had lived it. Knowing that science had advanced because of their pain did not erase the memories of broken windows, of fists pounding walls, of sisters hiding in locked bedrooms. For the surviving Galvin children, the legacy was not only in medical journals, but also in their bones, in the anxiety that lurked when a child of theirs grew too quiet, in the fear that one day the curse would return in another generation. But there was something else too, something quieter that resisted the darkness. Amid the tragedy, the family's story became one of survival. The daughters, though scarred, built lives beyond Hidden Valley Road. Some became advocates, speaking about mental illness in ways their mother never could. Others raised families of their own, determined to break the cycle of silence. Their survival was not perfect. How could it be? But it was proof that the Galvin curse had not claimed them entirely. The house itself still stood, weathered and quiet, its windows gazing out at the mountains as if keeping its secrets. To strangers, it was just another old home on a forgotten road. But to those who knew its history, it was a monument to a family that had been both broken and immortalized. Their suffering turned into science, their story etched into the understanding of madness itself. The legacy of the Galvin curse was not only a tale of tragedy, but also a reminder of the fragile line between order and chaos, between health and illness, between the perfect family and the shattered one. It was a story that terrified genetic science because it forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, destiny is written not in choices or circumstances, but in the very code of our blood. And on Hidden Valley Road, that code had revealed itself in the most merciless way imaginable.